the student union, rent, create jobs and bring in a national living wage. We have a great lineup of speakers for this session. It's a privilege to introduce Diane when she gets here, Leah Edwards, who is the SOAS Student Union Co-President for Welfare and Campaigns, Shelly Asquith, who's the President of the University of Arts London Students' Union, and Daniel Cooper from the National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts. So some of the questions we're going to be talking about today is how can we campaign to stop rising rents and force universities to provide affordable accommodation? What needs to be done to stop the rising energy bills and food prices? Tackling unemployment requires the government to create jobs. How can this be done? What can we do to oppose pay cuts and attacks on working conditions? And finally, how should we resist the attempt by some politicians to blame failing living standards on immigrants and benefit claimants as are those who are actually to blame for the crisis? So our first speaker is Shelly Asquith. Shelly is the President of the University of Arts London Student Union. Shelly was elected on a platform of fighting fees and cuts and also campaigning for affordable, decent accommodation for all students.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. So yeah, bear with me, I've got a bit of a cold this morning and this is the second panel that I've been on today with Diane Abbott, so I'm like doubly nervous because she's amazing and I'm an amateur. As Charlotte said, I'm from University of the Arts and it's the biggest arts and design institution in the world. We've got students from FE and HE, we're one of the most international institutions in the world. And I think we've got some of the most hard up students actually in the country. And the campaign that our students' union's been running as of this year is about tackling the cost of being a student in the arts and being a student in London specifically as well. And being in the arts, I think the cost of living is it's even bigger an issue than it is kind of more generally, because being an art student you've got to fork out a lot of money on stuff. Being an art student you've got to buy materials, fabrics, cameras, all this sort of thing that goes along with your studies, and if you're not rich then that's a hard feat. And then when you've finished being a student you're going into an employment market with mass youth unemployment. You're going into an industry that's having huge cuts. The arts and fashion are having huge cuts put on them, and it's one of the most underfunded industries in the economy. And the cost of living crisis is affecting our students, but it's affecting all students. And I think it's one of the biggest issues in the student movement for us to take on, because it breeds a whole lot of other problems as well. It breeds homelessness, and I mean literally we've had students at the beginning of term coming to our student union telling us that they've been having to sleep rough because they can't afford student accommodation, they can't afford the private rented sector. It also breeds a decline in working class people being able to access education because they can't afford it. It's breeding the number of students that are literally living in poverty. And we know that austerity also breeds racism and fascism. Far right flourishes in times of austerity and cuts, and we're also seeing the student movement being divided in this respect. Home students being pitted against international students being seen as a scapegoat for a whole lot of issues that are actually just a product of the rising cost of living. So our campaign is kind of central to tackling austerity, capitalism and the marketisation of education and the impacts that it's having on our students. And the biggest kind of campaign that we're running is about housing and the cost of it at our university. So in the last 3 years, the cheapest room that you can get in student accommodation has gone up by 57%. When I was a fresher, I lived in halls and it was £83 a week. But any fresher coming to our institution now will be paying between £130 a week and £300 a week. And when you think about how much students are getting in their loans and in their grants, the maximum you can get is £8,300 for the year. And the average rent costs that much. So where is the money coming from for travel, for course materials, and for a whole other range of things like basic as food? So students are really suffering, and the cost of housing is coming because of an increase in privatisation of the housing stock that universities provide. So nearly all of our housing at UAL is run by private providers. It's being increasingly commodified, so it's no longer a social good to provide housing at universities. It's seen as something that should be flashy, that should look like a Hilton hotel. You should get your ensuite and you should get a kitchen in there as well. And actually students just want a basic bed and a desk and a roof over their head. They don't want this sort of flashy accommodation that private providers are so often marketing to students and increasingly marketed to international students. So that's kind of our main campaign at the moment, the fact that rents aren't matching the typical student income. But there's a whole other lot of issues that are affecting the cost of living for students. Healthcare is becoming increasingly out of reach to students, and particularly international students. As the government is trying to Americanise our system, we've got the threat of international students having to possibly pay for accessing the National Health Service. And I know that students across the country have been campaigning against that, but we need to really up the fight against that. Come down and join us, Diane. Sorry to put all eyes on you. Travel is also a big financial burden, and particularly for students in London. We're having rises above inflation year on year, thanks to the arsehole that is Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London. Yeah, don't clap him, but clap the fact that he's an arsehole. We've got more above inflation fare rises coming along in January, and this doesn't take into account the fact that student incomes aren't going up. In fact, they're being frozen. And not just student incomes, but everyone's incomes are not rising with inflation, let alone above inflation. So students are being kept in poverty by the government, by our loans and our grants being frozen, the fact that your average loan will be £6,000 but your rent will be £8,000, that just doesn't add up. That rises are going up above inflation, whether that's food, transport, housing, and the payment of loans are coming in way before students are expected to pay their deposits or expected to move to a different city to study in. So I don't understand why students are expected to find £500 on a whim, £500 on a whim to pay for a deposit before they've even got their loan through. And this is all just keeping working class people out of education. It's keeping students in poverty. So as well as students being in poverty while they're in education, I just want to talk a little bit about students who are actually graduating into poverty as well. I said about us having mass youth unemployment at the moment, and this is especially if you're a young black student, you're graduating into a time where 50% of young black men are out of work. You're graduating into a culture of unpaid internships and workfare, so even if you can find work, quite often it's not even paid at least the national minimum wage, let alone a living wage. And you're also graduating with a huge burden of debt, and as we know, the government now wants to privatise our debt, which could mean the rate in which we pay it back will be increased, the time in which we pay it back will be sooner, and this is a huge, huge problem that we need to be campaigning against. I talked about the living wage just briefly. We're also campaigning for a living wage for our staff at University of the Arts, and I know institutions across the country are campaigning for a living wage. But this isn't just about the hundreds of cleaners at my institution that are earning national minimum wage on 0 hours contracts, that are travelling across the city 3 times a day to clean for different offices and then work as dinner ladies and never see their children. This is about students that are graduating into work that isn't paid a living wage as well. This is about all of us. This is about the women that are more likely to be earning below living wage across the country. So we need to be joining up with trade unions that are fighting on these issues, and we need to be joining up with the workers on our campuses that are fighting these issues. I just want to talk a little bit more about the campaign that we're running at UAL against the rising costs of living. I've got a few quotes that I've pulled out from first year students that have signed up to our campaign, just to give a kind of a context of the type of issues that they're facing. One student said, "I have to go to the food bank to afford my groceries." Another said, "After my rent, I've just got 20 quid left to live on." "I've had to max out credit cards and go to payday lenders to pay my rent." "Cut the costs and make education free." Yes, mate. Student prices, not Tory government prices. Again, yes. We've had thousands of students signing up to our campaigns to cut the rents, but it's not enough just to get a little quote on a piece of paper. We need to be radicalising this campaign a lot more, and we need a national coordinated serious campaign, particularly about the cost of student housing. I don't think NUS or the kind of leadership of the student movement is really acting, and this is where the grassroots really need to rise up and do something about it. We've got sections of the student movement that are still banging on about management-friendly campaigns, whether that's quick turnaround time for feedback, or whether that's longer library opening hours, or more contact time. And these are the kinds of campaigns that really piss me off, because they're the type of campaigns that university management want us to be running, They're the kind of campaigns that divide students and workers and institutions. They pit us against our staff, who aren't necessarily going to be earning more to work longer hours in libraries, or aren't necessarily going to be earning more to give you your feedback time, cut your feedback time down. And I'm not against anyone campaigning for better education services, but that needs to go hand in hand with a rise in wages and a rise in teaching budgets. But I think what we need to be talking about is this issue of the rising cost of living. And we need to step up our campaign tactics. We need to be talking about occupying management buildings over the prioritisation of student housing. We need to be demonstrating more and more. We need to be calling for rent strikes over the cost of halls fees. We need to be calling for fee strikes over the cost of fees. And we need to be really stepping up the fight back nationally. We need to be standing alongside trade union comrades. When they were out on Thursday, that was over the rising cost of living as well. That was over the fact that their pay isn't matching the rising cost of living and isn't going up, at least with inflation. We need to be walking out and demonstrating and making a visible argument as to why we won't stand for a capitalist system that's pricing us out of education and keeping our peers and the workers in education in poverty. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Shelly. So our next speaker is Diane Abbott, who Diane has been a member of the Parliament for Hackney North and Stoke Newington since 1987, when she made history of becoming the first black woman ever elected to the British Parliament. So thank you, Diane.
You've had a very thorough analysis of the cost of living crisis facing students. I just want to touch on three things. The first thing is the whole structure of fees and loans that students now find themselves burdened with. I mean, I voted against tuition fees under a Labour government. Well, it was a tricky thing for a Labour MP to do. And I certainly voted against the coalition hike in tuition fees. And I think that an incoming Labour government has to look again at the structure of student finance, because there are families, certainly families in the East End of London, where the older child went to uni, got all this debt, hasn't got a job, so the younger children are saying, well, that's not for me. So the danger with the current structure of student finance is you're going to set in reverse recent trends about widening participation. So I think we have to look again. The problem with tuition fees always was, even under Labour government, was that once you injected the market into students and university and college life, it's only downhill from there on. So I think a Labour government has to look again at the whole structure of fees and loans. And if they were to privatise student loans, then we should certainly bring them back into the public space. The other thing I wanted to talk about was rents. Now, obviously, students are in a particular rental market in London, but I think generally about housing in London, people on the left have to have a completely fresh look at housing, because what you've got is a massively distorted housing market, which is driven by very rich people that can move into the centre, Kensington, Knightsbridge. That's nothing to do with me. I don't want to live in Kensington, Knightsbridge. What happens is that, well, you might want to, but you couldn't afford to. But what happens is that pushes people who might have lived in those areas out into the outer suburbs. I mean, my family are from the Caribbean, and a lot of my relatives lived in Brent. Brent, back in the day, 70s, 80s, was a place where poor people and immigrants lived. Now, the editor of Vogue, the high-class women's fashion magazine, lives in Queen's Park in Brent. And I said to myself, what is going on? If those sorts of people are living in areas where historically first-generation immigrants and working-class people live, where are students, migrants, and the poor supposed to live? We are moving to a situation like Paris, where the centre of London is only for the relatively well-off, and the poor and migrants live walled in effect, in the outer suburbs. I think there are two answers to that, which will affect the availability for housing students in the long run. One is to introduce a measure of rent control into London. They have rent controls in New York. New York is scarcely a socialist republic. But unless you do something about rent, you notice that unless you do something about rents in cities like London and New York, very rapidly, only the wealthy can afford to live there. And that's not just an issue for you as students seeking accommodation. It'll be an issue for you as young adults who might want to live in London. We're seeing in Hackney a generation of head teachers who bought their house in Hackney at the beginning of the 80s, when you could buy a house in Hackney on an average salary, retire and move on. It's going to be increasingly difficult in the public sector to recruit people like you as you leave uni and training and college if you can't afford to buy a family home inside London. So we need to do something about rents, and we need to build much more council housing. The low level of council houses that were built under Labour government was a disgrace. It's not much better under the Tories. So there's two things: bearing down on rents, building more social housing, and of course looking at the sort of rents that students have to pay in student accommodation. They have to be the key to the housing crisis in London. You cannot have a city where rents are so out of sync with average income, and it's not going to get better, it's actually going to get worse. The other thing I wanted to talk about, apart from housing, was the other practical thing that can be done at people's cost of living, and that's transport. One of the biggest lumps out of, you will find this when you leave uni and college and move into the world of work, one of the biggest lumps out of your salaries will be transport costs. And I think that anybody that is serious about running for mayor, whether they're Labour or Conservative, in 2016, has to look at the very least, freezing fares, but also cutting fares. It's the one simple thing that an incoming mayor of London could do to help Londoners, including students, with their cost of living costs. So the cost of living crisis is real. It points to the price that ordinary people are paying for austerity. We can spend millions and millions bailing out banks, including RBS, but we haven't got the money to subsidise affordable housing in London. It's real, it points to the cost of austerity, and the fact that it's real and getting worse points to how distant David Cameron and George Osborne are for the lives of ordinary Londoners, including students. So, glad to come here and speak. I was actually at a meeting with you earlier. I should have followed you.
I know, but you were off talking to different people. I couldn't get you away. So.
Anyway, so I'm glad to be here to speak. Students, you all have your particular challenge, students, whether you're at college or uni, but more challenging still will be the world that you step out to once you finally finish your education. So obviously you're campaigning on issues which relate to you, but also you should be working with women's groups, with trade unions, to fight on these issues around austerity, because it's all about justice for you going forward and justice for our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diane. Our next speaker is Leah Edwards. Leah is Co-President Welfare and Campaigns at SOAS Student Union. She also previously served as the Students' Union Accommodation Officer, setting up and chairing a residence council in the halls of residents. Over to you, Leah.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. So I think we all really know about the issues that are facing students in terms of housing: rising rents, road landlords, these private providers. And I think we've all heard stories of students living in broom cupboards, landlords who waltz into your house while you're in the shower, UCL's Carbuncle Cup building where you pay £700 for the privilege of living without any daylight, and of these private providers who seem to think that students form this huge untapped market as if we've got money growing on trees. But the reality is that student accommodation costs on average £120 a week in the rest of the country, and in London it's much higher, and that comes to £5,244 a year. And I don't think you need to be a maths genius to work out that at the maximum rent, the maximum loan that you get in the rest of the country doesn't even come close to covering that. These aren't facts that need telling to an audience that's living with a housing crisis in this country and in an education sector that views us primarily as potential income. And I think the housing issue can be something that seems so huge or so difficult to tackle, but actually it's something that's so easy to mobilise around because it affects everyone. All of us are paying ridiculous rents for our housing. All of us have to pay just fees that are pulled out of the air to letting agents. All of us are putting huge deposits into our house at the start, if we even manage to find a house in the first place. But I think what the thing is, the thing that all comes down to in the private rental sector is that we're dealing with a completely unregulated system, as Diane said, that we need to be thinking about rent controls, and we need to be thinking about other regulation within the housing market. The housing shortage in the country has increased competition in the rental market, causing particularly acute difficulties in London, where there's a constant influx of new people and new money. This, along with increasing house prices, have caused rents to skyrocket. At the same time, increasing house prices have pushed more and more people into the private rental sector. So Shelter have reported that there's over 9 million renters in Britain. I think it's probably much higher than that if we include students who are renting in privately provided and purpose-built accommodation. Yet little's been done to tackle these issues at government level, and the Conservative Party is still banging on about homeowners rather than looking at renters who are left completely vulnerable at the hands of multiplying landlords and letting agents. And our tenants' rights are so few, and although the introduction of tenancy deposit scheme in 2004 was a step in the right direction, landlords are still able to terminate contracts with a month's notice, and you have families living on short-hold tenancies that last a year. So every year they have to face the risk of being dispossessed and left homeless. They're able to charge whatever rent they like, impose whatever conditions they like, let houses which meet very basic minimum standard of safety, and particularly in areas where the demand's really high, like in London. And it's easy to bash landlords over this, and it appears that they're the ones making the money. But more and more people on middle incomes are letting properties now as well, because it's seen as a viable option, and they're not actually ready to be landlords. They're not taking this on as a real responsibility. They're taking it on because they, like many of the rest of us, are struggling to get by on the income that they've got. And so actually, there's no accountability, and accreditation schemes aren't really working. Their sign-up is voluntary, they can't be sustained accurately, and we're seeing a similar picture in student-built accommodation as well. So how do we tackle this problem? I mean, I haven't got the answers. I don't want to preach to you. I'm not here to lecture about that. I think we need to have a really big discussion amongst ourselves, between universities, within our universities, and with local groups as well. And I think we're in a quite unique position that we can do this in two ways. We can do this within our own universities, as Shelly spoke about, and put pressure on our universities to be building more accommodation, while we're also putting pressure on the government to be building more accommodation. I think there's an untapped potential for new kinds of accommodation, student accommodation, that our universities should be looking at. They're in a situation now where there's increased competition between our universities, and actually they should be looking at that as competitive. They should be looking at providing good, cheap accommodation as one thing that they can do to pull people into their universities, and they should be looking into housing co-ops, headed tenancy schemes, and innovative and new ways of providing accommodation for students. We've been dealing with the same type of accommodation for students for years and years and years. I think we also need to put pressure on our institutions from all angles to bring down accommodation more broadly, accommodation prices more broadly, and so because actually large majority of our university, at least at SOAS, are in the private rental sector. It's a very small minority who are in student accommodation. And we need to secure a long-term commitment from our universities to improving accommodation, both purpose-built but also in the rental sector. I think as students we have this really unique opportunity to reach out to a huge community of tenants and renters amongst us, who we can actually mobilise and galvanise the support within our universities. We meet people on a daily basis, and actually people in our communities who are going out to work, who have children, who maybe have disabilities or who have low income and are working lots of jobs, it's going to be very difficult for them to fight against these things. We have a unique opportunity that we can actually start fighting for rent controls, for the abolishment of letting agent fees, which they don't have in Scotland, so it can be done, and we should be doing it here. So I think we should also be reaching out to local groups, residents' associations, tenants' unions, support groups that are springing up all over the place, and some that have been going for years. But we should be galvanising these with a student voice, a voice that speaks with energy and enthusiasm, and a voice that speaks from a community that's ready to fight on this. Thank you very much.
speaker is Daniel Cooper from the National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts, which is a network of student and education worker activists. Thank you, Daniel.
Hello everyone. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I only found out I was speaking 10 minutes ago, so you'll have to permit me if I do look down at my notes. So 3 years ago, the government set out far-ranging cuts, 100%, 80% to departments. 4 years in, despite that, I think it's fair to say that university finances have remained relatively stable. But you've also had something where vice-chancellors have vacillated. They've been nervous to make cuts. Now, I'm not saying that there hasn't been cuts. There certainly has been. I've faced them where I was a student at Royal Holloway. But we haven't seen them in the kind of hefty style as we expected. I think what we are seeing, firstly, is isolated, but in some instances at Sussex, here at the University of London, dramatic attacks on labour, on staff, contracting out, privatisation, etc. But I think the area that we, as the kind of the left of the student movement, need to take up is the question of housing and of the cost of living. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics, the high politics, how we're facing a kind of profound attack on the questions of housing. But what I want to convince you of, what I think is probably going to be the most effective instrument for tackling high rents and substandard quality of accommodation on campus is the creation of tenants' unions, but also to carry out rent strikes. And I want to convince you, I want to kind of work these things through. It's worth saying that we've kind of made plans, and this is exactly what we're kind of doing at the moment at Royal Holloway. So it's undeniable that there is a housing crisis. Students are at the sharp end of it. We're on low incomes, we're often new to the city, and we pay astronomical sums of money. And we've got landlords who, in my view, act as parasites, really, who mistreat us, who do all the kinds of things that Shelly and Leah mentioned. I think the first thing that's important as students on the ground is for us to be aware of our rights, for us to be clued up. And one of the things I wanted to give out was a booklet that we've produced through the University of London Union, where I'm one of the student officers. It talks about, there's lots of them there, I recommend people take them up. It talks about tenancy agreements, it talks about inventory rates, it talks about the kind of things that you need to check through when the things that your landlord's asking you, it talks about disrepair, it talks about all of those kinds of things. Because I remember, when I still do, the landlord will say that this is how something has to be, and you take it. This is how things have got to be. But in most instances, landlords break the law, and can be taken either to court, or action can be taken against them. Or if anything, you can cite the law to them as you're in breach of this. This is something that you must uphold. So I think being aware of your rights is fundamental and something we need to kind of educate ourselves about. The second thing I think is about campus campaigns and developing those at our universities and colleges. Now, the area of focus that I think we should take up is on halls of residence. So you have large concentrations, large numbers of students in the region. It depends on the size of your university. Several thousand arriving and living in halls of residence. Most of them, in the experience that I have, aren't a particularly good quality, are privatised, are contracted out and run not by the university, and are extremely, extremely expensive. Now, at Royal Holloway, I think it's probably at most campuses, we have maybe 13 or so halls of residence. And the halls of residence are going to be the nucleus of any campaign. And I think the campaign needs to do two things on campus. Your housing campaign needs to do two things on campus. Firstly, it needs to deal with some of the bread and butter issues that come up in halls. And the second thing that it needs to do is to build a campaign to get the university to reduce the rate of rent, and that I'll come on to in a little while, but also to invest and spend some money on the halls of residence. And I guess that means furnishing it with nice mattresses and nice tables, but also paying staff properly and making sure that they get access to basic rights. So I think the campaign starts really in what we've done at Royal Holloway, the beginning of the term, and I think you should do this when you get back if this is something that you think would be worthwhile. Is we've picked one halls of residence out of the 30. This is the most expensive, called Wedderburn. We've gone in, there's 567 rooms. We knocked on every single one of them, and we've told people, what are your issues? And in the main, those have been questions of the laundry facilities, post, where you get your post, about the bath and the shower facilities, about the inadequate cooking facilities, shoddy furniture and stuff like that. Talk to people, we've asked them what are those issues, but also inform them about this bigger campaign to get the university to reduce the rent. We hold fortnightly halls meetings. So I don't know if you have at different universities, you have kind of walled off, you have a section, another section, another section. You have a different meeting in each of those on one evening. On a Tuesday evening, we always hold those meetings. You elect a halls committee, a committee of people that take on the work of the campaign. And you have reps that then meet for the whole of the halls of residence to discuss what the campaign's doing, what it can be doing. I think some of the other tactics that we should take up are firstly surveys that ask students about their lives. Most can barely afford to buy food. We need to get some data, qualitative data about what's going on in students' lives. I think that's the first thing. I think we can hold public meetings on campus about the bigger issues. We invite in shelter, charities, campaign groups to talk about the issues across campus, and we talk about them in political terms as well. I think the other thing that's important is about researching what the main demand is. I think at base, it's got to be that the amount that we pay covers the cost of running the halls of residence, but that the university makes no profit on the halls of residence at all. And that might demand a 10%. So your figure could be a 10% decrease in the university's halls of residence, across the halls of residence as well. It can involve petitions, posters, all of these kind of things. I think it's going to take for us some time going to halls of residence, building up a relationship with people, holding these meetings to get to a point where people come to meetings. It's actually gone quite well. In all of the committee all of the halls meetings that we've had, out the kind of, imagine there's 600 students in them, on different areas, we're getting big turnouts, because students are pissed off about the quality of the halls, but also want to do something about it and see this as a way to do something about it. Now, it's worth saying that most university managements are, I think it's fair to say, fairly intransigent on any progress, any advancement, any improvement on the quality of life for their students. And so, whilst we may ask them politely, please, Mr. Vice-Chancellor, reduce the cost of our halls of residence, it's quite unlikely, even if you present them with a petition. In fact, we've done that. We had 400 or so people in that particular halls of residence present a petition to the Vice-Chancellor. And he said, don't think so, we've got no money to do it. So what we've started to develop is the unions, there's the committees and what have you. But I think the instrument that's going to put the most amount of pressure is in the second term, when students go on to pay when they're expected to pay their rent in the second term, that they refuse to pay it. So you arrive back on the 9th of January, and by the 14th you're expected to pay your £1,500. That comes from your account, and it's paid directly to the university. I think you want to get to a point where students say, we're not going to pay this. And actually, if you think about our university occupations, in general, they do have widespread support, but the numbers there are of a fairly small minority of the university. I think they do have widespread support, but small numbers are there. The same can still be the case with halls of residence. I did a little bit of, my economics degree came in a little bit useful. If you were to have 30 students in a halls of residence of 500, it could have a large financial impact. So, for example, 30 times everyone's paying 1,500 back in January. 30 times 1,500 is 45k. That would be depriving the university of £45,000. Now, that's coupled with a high-profile campaign, with media, etc. I think it will be the thing that gets universities to act on these issues. And there are instances, particularly in the States, where they've got actually quite a rich tradition of tenants' union organising, of them putting pressure through the rent strike model and it having quite a big effect. So that would be my contribution to what the student movement should take up, the building of tenants' unions in halls of residence, that the ultimate, but probably the most effective tactic that kind of brings that to a conclusion is a strike, a withdrawal of funding, and the building of collective action. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So thank you to all our speakers for some really helpful insights. I'm going to open the floor now to any questions or inputs anyone's got to put. So, yeah.
Thanks very much to the panel. It's just three quick things really. First of all,
One of the things that I think we should be talking about is a completely separate issue, but I thought our response as a party to the whole racist ban business, this ban going on in London saying everyone's go home, and the whole Tory onslaught, about they wanted school children to show their ID when they started school, they backed off that for a bit, but now if you go into hospital, a landlord, you're talking about rentals, but landlords are now going to have to check people's immigration status, and the temptation will be, if you're a small-scale private sector landlord, to look at somebody who's a person of colour or wearing a hijab and say, the room's gone. So we haven't been anywhere near brave about all these issues. I think in terms of, I don't see how you come to grips with the housing crisis in London specifically, unless you A, build more council housing, and B, do something about rental. And that's certainly what I'm going to be pressing, both in public like this, but also behind the scenes. I think Labour suffers from the kind of the Blair legacy, and the Blair legacy, there were lots of things about it. One thing was, you looked at the opinion polls and you gave people what they said they wanted. And what the polling shows is what the Tories are doing on cuts and benefits, and the Tories, those things are very popular, and we're frightened to actually offer opposition. But I think unless we offer a real alternative, and now, kind of window opportunity for us to actually stand up for radical policies and then campaign for them is closing. Basically, I agree with you. We need to be more radical. We need to be more radical about the things people care about, which is their living standards, their children's futures, and the health service. Yeah.
Also, just at this stage, I kind of think, what do you have to lose by being more angry?
Well, it's not even.
By being more publicly, having a.
Yeah, it's not even about being angry exactly. What do we have to lose by being more practical? We are still signed up to spend 34 billion on Trident, something which is of no earthly use to anyone, and yet we're complaining about the cost of the high-speed railway line. At least you get a few trains. At least you get a few trains people can see. Trident does nothing for anybody. It's not even about the far shores of Marxism. It's some practical things. Do something about rental costs in London. Fight austerity, because austerity actually only leads to a downward economic spiral for ordinary people. Yeah, what have we got to lose by saying the things which ordinary people want said? And I found when I was running for the leadership 3 years ago, and I find now that when you get up in public to quite ordinary middle-of-the-road audiences and talk about things like rent controls, talk about things like reversing the privatisation of the health service, you actually get a really positive response. So I think we have nothing to lose, and certainly in my way, that's why I'm out at meetings like this. I was at another meeting earlier. I'm trying to bang the drum for policies which more nearly meet the needs, not just of students, but of ordinary people.
Yeah, can I? Just on Labour being more radical, completely agree. It should be, and I think actually it's in its electoral interest to be more radical. I think there's a huge progressive majority out there that wants to vote Labour, if only it wasn't just like the Tories. And Diane on the panel that we were on earlier made a really good point about how we need not to be scrambling around for votes, to take votes off of UKIP when it comes to the next election. We need to be really clear with the Labour Party that being racist and being pro-cuts is not going to get them anywhere. On the lockers, do you mean like lockers that you put your stuff in?
actual lockers.
I don't know what to suggest, because we've just been lobbying to get rid of lockers at my old college and make way for a prayer room. So getting more lockers, I don't know what the answer is there. Hopefully someone else might have some tips. On the halls, the privatisation of halls, absolutely, I think there's a good argument here that we can make to universities in that it makes sense for them to offer decent, affordable housing for students. Because not only is it good for their social life in the first year and good for the student experience, but it's a lot safer. It's also a lot easier, particularly for international students that have no idea how to navigate the private rented sector system. But with the privatisation, what it's done with institutions is it's making them compete against each other. And I know that my institution, at least, has recently been competing against LSE and UCL for private buildings. And what that does is just inflate the amount of money that these private companies think that they can pay. And we need our universities to actually be working together collectively to drive down the prices, not compete against each other. So not only should they be building university-owned and university-run and cheap accommodation, but they need to be collectively bargaining when it comes to other forms of accommodation to make those rents a lot cheaper. On the National Day of Action and what we can do, there's a big national conference on student housing on the 4th of December, which all the investment banks are going to, all the heads of accommodation services at institutions that are earning like 100k, all the private companies that build halls like Unite or Find Digs or Sanctuary or whatever they're called, they'll all be going there, and it's £400 a ticket for the day. So I think we should be there. I don't think we should buy tickets, but I think we should find a way in anyway, or at least stand outside and make some noise, and we should be doing some sort of National Day of Action on the 4th of December at that conference. But I think we also need to be doing our own conference to talk about our own issues, what we as students need, not what these private companies and investment banks want to make out of us.
Just a few points. Firstly, I'd be really interested to hear what people think about building tenants' unions committees in halls of residence. So just to urge people to say something about it. Just a few ideas about the housing campaigns on campus that I forgot. Firstly, an idea is to do an alternative MTV Cribs. When I told this to these guys earlier, they were just like, what's a Cribs? So Cribs is a thing that MTV used to put on, where they go to Naomi Campbell's house, they go to various other famous people's houses, and you go, oh, look at their TV, look at the marble floor, oh wow. For this, we would go to halls of residence, and we would see the risory state of the bed or of the bathroom and stuff like that, and we'd make videos, and those would go viral. First thing. Secondly, we'd do an alternative. Secondly, we do an alternative student brochure. So, the university puts together a brochure about the quality of the halls of residence. We'd put one together, and we'd give them out on open days. Third thing is that I can't stress enough how important building the organisation is. Sussex earlier talked about taking time to do that. This is key. Taking time to have conversations, go to people's rooms, talk to them, knock on their doors, and building those meetings is very, very important. Because actually there'll exist even students doing it for 1 year or go into a second year. So getting the reps, the committees formed is very, very important. The other thing which we mentioned in here, and someone mentioned international students. Sort of state-sponsored racism at London Met, attacks on visas, etc. But then there's also the housing question as well. And what we're doing in London, we've got kind of 6 or so universities to sign up to it now, is getting universities to act as guarantors for international students. So most, when you sign up for a house, if any of you have, you need to get your, on most occasions it's my mum, to sign and act as a guarantor for you. They can pay your rent on the occasion that you're not able to do it. That isn't the case. Most international students find that difficult because they don't have family in the UK. Most landlords and estate agents don't accept friends or just colleagues. So getting universities to play that role is very, very important. We've got a number of universities to do it. That's been about basic lobbying. Just quickly on the lockers. It sounds City University, that's where Thatcher studied law. I think it's a place that's fairly wealthy as well. I think write a letter, do a petition, go and throw some what would you put in your locker? Go and put it outside the VC's office en masse. I think all these kind of basic things will be quite effective for what is a fairly small demand.
I just wanted to come back because no one else answered him. The guy there who said, why are there so few students here and what should you do about it? I mean, I'm not a student, so I can only give you my observations from the outside. I mean, over time, over the past few decades, on the one hand, the National Organisation of Labour Students has been co-opted by people who quite, what can I say without being abusive? Yeah, that's one of the words that comes to mind. But really very curiously apolitical student elite who almost inevitably, the top ones, end up being MPs, and therefore don't want to do anything that will upset the Labour Party, that will stop them doing MPs. Therefore have nodded through tuition fees in the first place, no serious resistance to the Tory hiking tuition fees. And there is an issue about, I mean, you like to think when you're my age that young people coming after the Labour Party will be more radical than you. Not the case of the National Organisation of Labour Students, let me tell you. So I think there's an issue. There's an issue about the National Organisation of Labour Students and the way it's been co-opted by a particular fraction of the right in the Labour Party and by people who are quite intent on their personal careers. But I think students generally over the past few decades, you know, things are tough. People think they have to, you know, think about their own careers. It's a kind of backwash of Thatcherism about me and my own, rather than thinking collectively. So the difficulty of getting students to events like this is partly reflects a wider problem about people thinking collectively, not about their immediate interests. But I think some of the imaginative campaigning ideas you've heard today, like dumping the contents of a locker outside a VC's door, might actually capture the imagination of students who are cynical about student organisation. But it is key you get them engaged, and also it is key that you reach out to women students and BME students also, because they're the majority of students, particularly in some of our London units.
We had a student fight back event a couple of weeks ago, and one of the points was raised was how to kind of activate the British citizen and the student in general, and it was basically about making things relatable. So we've got the National Day of Action for 5th of November, and like there's been some really good ideas raised about how to kind of get people's attention and stuff, and anything you guys put through your campuses, through your unis, through anything, it needs to be relatable to get people engaged. So if you want to do it about accommodation, the cribs idea is really good because that's people's lives and that's what you're displaying to the people that can take control of it, and just to kind of make it relatable will make it more effective to get more people to come here and to get more people engaged. Get some more questions, so right up there.
Yeah, hi. I'm Luke from the board of Austerity, which is the European School.
Some of the things people have said as well. I really want to reiterate what Dan was saying about guarantors, getting your institutions to act as guarantors for students. I know a lot of institutions are doing this already for international students, but it needs to be done for students from low-income backgrounds, care leavers, LGBT students that are otherwise estranged from their families. I had real issue finding a guarantor when I went into a private flat. I ended up getting some random bloke off Twitter to be my guarantor, so thanks to Captain Disco, I've now got a flat. The protest picnic sounds like an excellent idea. It also sounds very Cambridge. We've been doing, as Aaron kind of alluded to, we've been doing some similar stuff at UAL. We've been occupying spaces on the colleges with tents and sleeping bags and things, with signs saying, you know, my loan is 6k, my rent is 8k, just to demonstrate the fact that students can't afford university accommodation. So more of that is great, and it's a really visible way of getting more students to kind of recognise the issue and then want to get involved in fighting it. And then EMA as well, like, I totally agree with the person at the back about getting college and school students to unite in this struggle as well. I got EMA 30 quid a week. My bus, I came from Essex as well, was 28 quid a week to get to college. And so the other £2 I obviously spent on booze and fags, because that's what the government seems to think that we all spent our EMA on. Whatever. So I guess just to close, yeah, 4th of December, the big bosses conference. Let's do something about it. I'm not sure what yet, but let's come up with some ideas, and let's just create more of a dialogue so that we're all working together on fighting these issues like housing and others.
I think Aaron made a good point about leadership. You know, historically, when I say historically, back in the 80s, students were often a flashpoint of opposition to all sorts of backwards social government activities, and students can be a flashpoint again. And sometimes it just takes the right leadership in an institution that it can be turned around, and you can get people coming along who wouldn't think they would come along. I do think it's important to try and start a kind of tide around this issue of rents. People have, I mean, you know, the average rent in London last month was £1,000 a month. You know, £1,000 a month. People contacted me in Clapton where their landlord wants £2,000 a month out of them for a 2-bedroom flat. That's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. And it's an issue for students, an issue for young adults, but an issue for workers in London generally. So that's one of my big things at the moment. What are we going to do about a totally out of control housing market in London, which is squeezing students and ordinary workers out of it?
Thank you very much.
I think I just want to come back again on what you were saying about why is there not more people here, and I think that actually housing is something that we can bring people together on, and not just students, but like, you know, it's something that actually, yeah, we should be, HE students and FE students should be coming together on. We should be going out into our local community, we should be knocking on doors, we should be actually physically getting out there and speaking to people about this, because as soon as you get people speaking about housing, it's a tirade, you know, people have got issues with it, and once you've got that anger behind it, once you've got people talking about how unfair the system is at the moment, actually we can start doing something with that energy. And I think some of the ideas that Dan's come up with, sort of thinking around creative campaigning and things that are quite accessible to people and open and show that you're not alone in this, and that actually we are fighting together and that we're coming up with solutions, is a really good way that we can actually get students who may be apathetic or people who might be too busy actually on board in some way, even if it's just watching a video or signing a petition, or if it is doing a rent strike, or if it's occupying. You know, we need to provide levels of involvement for people to get on involved with this, so we have a sort of joined up approach. And again, the 4th of December, I think that's excellent that Shelly's brought that up and brought that to our attention, because that could be a flashpoint, and that could be something that we all build for from this point onwards. Just again touching on what Daniel said about tenants' unions, I think that's something we really should be doing, and it does take a lot of organisation, and I think we should be getting on with it, and we should be doing it. And I think at the same time we should be using those tenants' unions more broadly as well to support our fellow students in the private renter sector, and be using those tenants' unions to support other students in prosecuting landlords and starting to take some real action against landlords who are getting away scot-free at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Three things. Firstly, I'll be told if I don't say it. I'm on from the National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts. I encourage you to join. We have a conference coming up in late November. I welcome you all there. The first day will be workshops, discussions, and the second day is our decision making is democratic. All members can vote and decide and discuss and debate. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think we need to develop a national campaign around the question of housing, and I'm aware that some of us took a motion to NUS last year. It was rejected about doing a national campaign. I think it needs to come from us, and maybe the headline for that in some cities, although I think we should call a national rate, is of the maximum rent to be £100. And you can have regional variations depending on that per week. But I think we need to do some research into that, and we need to make a national demand as well, because if anything, that forces down the amount that universities and private sector, because if we have a visible campaign, it forces down the amount that VCs, etc. want to pay. If there's no campaign, they can do it as they wish. Thirdly, I want you to take up the creation of tenants' unions. I want you to think what can be a potentially effective instrument of that, of rent strikes. Two areas in it. I think the tactics are surveys. Everyone likes the cribs with videos, etc., doing pickets, but it's all underpinned by organisation, but getting all of that going on campus. But I think it's the kind of thing that you can dedicate a lot, like this is the kind of thing you can, like if you're in the halls of residence, you see people every single day already. This is the kind of thing your student union activists should be doing as well, your campaign group should be taking up as well. And you just go to halls every single day and you knock on doors. Now, I'm not going to laud Sussex anymore because they don't, they've received lots of it today. But and they may not know this, but we did lots of research into tenants' unions, and there's lots of them, like I said, in the States. But actually in Sussex, at the university in 1971, you had mass withdrawal of rent. And that forced the university to cancel its 6.5 increase in the cost and actually reduce it. So they cancelled that but reduced it by 3.5%. And that was through the organisation, some of the things that I talked about, but eventually a strike where they refused to pay the university for 6 weeks. I think it's a very effective tool. Implore you to take it up. If you want to discuss it anymore, please do come and talk to me afterwards. Thank you very much.
So hopefully you've all got something to take away from our amazing panel. Next up in this room we have a workshop called Rise Against Racist Scapegoating, Immigrants and International Students Not to Blame. And in the Ramsey room we have a workshop called Organising the Fight Back Nationally and on Campus, getting ready